Hey everyone, in this video, or this presentation rather, I'll speak to you guys about perspective. This is the topic that I chose to work for my last presentation for my Philosophy 108 project. So let's get right into it. So what is perspective? Well, the simplest definition for me would be that it's the way someone views or interprets a situation from their position. So I think this image right here is a really good representation of our definition. It's a really good definition of what perspective is. It defines perspective really well, in my opinion. And I've also included a, a example from my own idea that there's, and again, there are many different definitions of perspective, but from my perspective, the ones above right here are easiest to comprehend. So I think that's a good example to use to define perspective, right? So, again, one's point of view, one's interpretation of a situation, or, the way someone views things from their position. All right. So, how are perspectives formed? Well, I think perspectives are formed usually subconsciously. So, you don't really realize when you're forming a perspective, right? So, again, a very common example I could use is that as you were viewing this presentation, or you were hearing me talk, or you were seeing, the template I chose for my presentation, or the colors I chose, right? You could be forming a perspective about this presentation, or me, the presenter, right? You could be forming a perspective right now. Now, perspective and thinking. Perspective and thinking are intertwined, right? I think it's like that you cannot put one aside and choose the other, because you're thinking you're thinking by using your thinking you interpret a situation, right, which allows you to form a perspective. On the other hand, your perspective can also shape the way you think about certain things or the world around you. So both are very much go hand in hand, and yeah, and they're very much intertwined. Now, since you mentioned thinking, the very first place where thinking happens is our intellectual environment. And because that's where our thinking happens, it also means that that's where we form a lot of our perspectives, right? So, what are our intellectual environments? Our intellectual environments are usually included in our school, colleges, universities, the religious communities that we're part of, our political settings, legal and corporate settings, and most importantly, our own houses and certain, where we surround ourselves with our family and friends. Now, perspective and worldviews. So the ideas that we develop in our intellectual environment, right? So, in our families, in religious communities, in high school and colleges, right? As we develop ideas through our intellectual environment, we also we picture world from our own perspective, which is known as worldview, right? This picture that we form is known as a worldview, which helps us understand what's going on around the world and helps us make decisions based on our perspective. Now, why is that important? Why is our worldview important? Well, just simply put, our worldviews are extremely important because they're part of the ideas that we accumulate from our intellectual environments, right? And we view the world through those lenses, right? A quote that I can use from the book Clear and Present Thinking is that our worldviews are intimately tied with our sense of who we are, how we want to live, and how we see our place in the world and the things that are important to us. Right? I think this is a very good quote, and it shows the significance of worldviews and why it's important to have a clear and concise worldview. Right. Now, looking at things from a different perspective, I think this is also important because when we have a worldview, when we have established a worldview by ourselves, right, it's very easy to think that our worldview is objective or the inherent truth, right? It's very easy to be inconsiderate of other worldviews, right? And that's where this comes from. That's where this happens. which is important. That's where we need to practice looking at things from a different perspective, right? So again, I'm using the same example here, is that you see a glass of milk, right? And the milk is halfway to the glass. So one's thinking it's half full and the other is thinking it's half empty. So which is true? Well, I'll let you decide for it, right? But inherently neither of them are wrong, right? The glass is indeed half full, but also half empty. So it's very important that we consider others' perspective, and also like when presented with a different perspective, that we consider others' perspective and put our perspective aside. And that's, well, how do we do that? How do we practice looking at things from a different perspective? Well, that's where being objective comes from, right? In order to look at things from a different perspective, we need to practice being objective. And objective here means leaving aside our influences from personal feelings, interests, biases, or expectations as much as possible, and including our own perspective, right? So refer back to the image on the seventh slide. Like I said, neither of them are wrong, right? Both are technically correct. So it's very important to be objective when when presented with another worldview and look at things from a different perspective. Like for example, we look at things from a global perspective or religious perspective or a social perspective, right? So the same thing applies here. Now, one important thing to realize is that perspectives can change over the course of our lifetime. So when we initially form a perspective about a situation or a thing, right, it's very easy to just have that perspective set and like not change it, right? But it's important to realize that, and sometimes when you're presented with new information, you might feel guilty or you might feel hesitant to change your perspective because of the initial perspective that was formed, right? But it's important to realize that perspective can indeed change when presented with new information, right? Or you critically self-reflect about what you think, or through formal education and research, right? And environmental factors, global events, right? And a very common thing right nowadays is technological advancements. So I'll give a few examples of that right here, right? So consider the first example, that the world that our parents grew up is significantly different from the world that we live in today, right? So if they were to raise us in a similar way they were raised, it might not be the same. It might not fully prepare us to our our worldly endeavors, right? Prepare us to challenge for the challenges and opportunities that we're going to face. So it's important to consider that our parents, the perspective that our parents has of the world is significantly different from the world that is currently. So, and another example I can think of technological advancement is that, well, if you know about AI, a thing or two about AI, such as ChatGPT or Gemini or Claude, right? A few years ago, when software engineering was a popular field, everyone wanted to major in computer science, right? Because it was in high demand. However, due to the advancement of artificial intelligence, many people are skeptical about pursuing this major right now because, and nowadays there's like new AI called Devin that can do a lot of tasks software engineers can do, right? So that's another thing to consider about your perspective. And again, perspective can change, and it's completely valid and fine to change your perspective. You don't have to hold on to the perspective that you initially formed, right? And that's where intellectual laziness comes from, where when you hold on to the perspective that is perhaps outdated, or you refuse to adopt a new one based on, like change, based on changes that happen in the world, or technological advancement or whatnot, or education, right? That's called practicing intellectual laziness. What is intellectual laziness? Well, it's a variation of intellectual laziness is willed ignorance. So when you're presented with information that is sufficient to sort of change your perspective, you still hold on to the initial perspective that you formed, right? That's sort of willed ignorance. You sort of discount And if you discount whatever that is presented to you, and you deliberately prevent yourself from answering hard questions and acknowledging relevant facts relating to your perspective, right? So that's something I think we should prevent and avoid practicing, most definitely when it comes to our perspective, forming a perspective or thought. Now, it's important to realize that our perspectives are powerful. Our perspective is extremely powerful, right? Perspective is, again, it's relative to individuals. However, that's what makes it so powerful and unique and special, right? Everyone in the world has a different perspective. That's why some people say, we're not living in the same world. Like me and you, we're not living in the same world because your world is completely different based on your perspective, and mine is, and same for me, right? So I think I think I can think of is that when we often compare ourselves to others who have more than us in life, we belittle ourselves, right? However, when you compare yourself to people who are less fortunate than us, we realize the blessings we are given. So I think that's why the perspective is powerful because in the first case, you sort of think that you're not doing much and you're not accomplished, you're not blessed, you don't feel as happy as with your life or as content. However, when you consider the second case, you realize that you sort of experience true contentment, you realize your blessings. So that's why I think perspective is a very powerful tool, and I think we should use it to our advantage rather than a disadvantage. And lastly, I want to end with a quote, right, from Oscar Wilde. He says, "The optimist sees the donut and the pessimist sees the hole." So this sort of refers to the example I gave right here is that it's how you look at things. It's a perspective. Your perspective is sort of shapes who you are in a way. So I think it's important that we practice positive perspective and positive outlook, right? Let's so these are some common questions that I want to present to you. That is it possible for a perspective to be either right or wrong? Now I say this because I want to give the example used in the textbook. So you have two people are arguing about death penalty, and one is saying it's morally permissible because of certain reasons, and the other is saying it's not. So who is right and who's wrong? Is it possible for a perspective to be either right or wrong? And if a perspective becomes right or wrong, then is it really a perspective anymore, or is it just something that is true and false? So I want you to think about that. Second question. So this sort of relates to the first question that is it possible to achieve objectivity in a perspective, or is perspective always subjective? So is it possible that the perspective that we shape or that we have formed within ourselves, is it possible that it's something that is objective, something that is universally true or accepted? Is it possible for a perspective to be like that, or is our perspective always subjective and always something that's just from our point of view? The last question I have for you is that do we shape our perspective or does our perspective shape us? So, you know, I want you to think about that a little. Does our perspective shape us or do we shape our perspective? Like, so when we think, is the other like it's a question that I want you to answer, and it's a pretty interesting question that I found. So yeah, thank you for your time, and these are the citations I have. Thank you.